What's up guys, Captain Blade J52 here with another video for our Tanking 101 series. Now in this video we're going to answer a question that I've been asked a few times before, and I know other tanks in the Stowe community have been asked a few times, and that is, how do I decide what ship to tank with and what kind of a tank can I make with the ship that I've chosen? And this is oftentimes followed by the additional question of, how do I know what abilities and consoles to use with the ship that I've picked? Now, picking a ship to tank with, along with abilities and equipment to put on it, can be a very daunting task for some people. This is especially true with the newer tanks, trying to decide what they're going to use from the myriad of options that are available out there today, as well as trying to decide what kind of a tank they actually want to create from the spectrum. Are they looking for something more of an off-tank style build, or do they want something more defense-focused like some of the builds I've seen Counter YOLO put out there? Or do they want something more towards the middle of the spectrum like what I do personally? Just like there's different kinds of DPS ships that exist, and there's different approaches to doing DPS, there's different kinds of tanks that exist as well. And my goal with this video is to give you guys a behind-the-scenes type of look, if you will, at how I personally evaluate ships, and hopefully give you some ideas that you can use to decide what ship and what kind of a tank is going to be right for you and best meet your goals for Star Trek Online. Now, this is by no means meant to be a universal standard, but purely to give you guys an idea that you can use to get started. And speaking of getting started, evaluating and picking a ship to tank with. How do I decide what ship to tank with and what kind of tank to make with that ship? Well, this is going to depend on several key factors. The first of which is your overall goals as a tank. You know, what are you looking to do? What do you want the ship to do? What do you need it to do? What kinds of content are you looking to go into? Are you looking to go elite mode only, or do you intend to never touch elite and stick to advanced and normal modes? What kind of enemies are you going to be fighting? What ships do you have available to you at the moment, or that you could potentially get your hands on? You know, what kind of team are you going in there with? Is this going to be a pug group? Is this going to be a dedicated team you're going to run with constantly? What are you looking to do as a tank? Because not all tanks share the same goals of tanking the same kinds of content, or even approaching that content in the same exact way. People looking to tank elite content exclusively aren't going to have the same needs as someone who never touches elite content, and the build styles of the two tanks are going to vary from each other, perhaps even dramatically. For example, tanking content of lesser difficulty is going to allow for greater flexibility of the overall build. Advanced and normal mode only tanks may not need as many of the big mega heals or mega defensives as the elite mode only tanks are going to need. This is because harder content is going to potentially necessitate the need for the larger mega heals and defensives, whereas the advanced and normal mode only tanks are going to have more freedom to bring more of their firepower to bear, since they're not going to require so many of the larger mega healing powers and mega defensive powers. So the advanced and normal mode only tanks are going to have a little bit more flexibility to work with than the elite mode only tanks are going to have. And the advanced and normal mode only tanks are going to have a bit easier time creating more off-tank style setups and middle of the spectrum versus elite mode only, that's probably going to lean a bit more towards the defensive side or towards middle of the spectrum. On the opposite end of the coin, tanking content of a higher difficulty can place heavy demands on certain ships that may be met easier by a different ship. As an example of this, an escort with 70k hull and 10k shields may not necessarily be able to handle as many of the larger one-hits as well as a bigger, beefier dreadnought that has 150k hull, and 30k shields. Having the extra hull and shields to work with can help you better withstand some of the larger single hits. However, being in a larger ship isn't going to automatically guarantee you can handle those hits. You know, I can't tell you guys the number of times that I've gone into a run in a more escort style ship and I've been able to withstand hits a lot easier than the bigger, beefier ships that should have a lot more hull and a lot more shields than I do. And this is, again, because I've tailored that ship better to what I need it to do as a tank, and I've invested more into the defensive side versus that bigger, beefier dreadnought. Now, generally by and large, just based on hull stats and shield stats, generally the bigger, beefier dreadnoughts, in just terms of pure numbers, are going to have a bit of an edge in absorbing those larger hits easier. It's not always the case, but it's a general rule of thumb that I kind of like to keep in mind. Now, with that said, all of the T5, T5U, Tier 6, and even quite a few of the Tier 4s can be made into excellent tanks in today's game. The thing that's going to matter is the amount of work needed and investment required to compensate for potential weaknesses of the ship, and is also going to vary based on your goals as a tank and what you're looking to do. The next thing to consider when trying to choose what kind of ship you're going to tank with is the flexibility of the bridge officer seating itself, such as how large is the pool of powers the ship can use. Ships with large amounts of specialist seating can provide more powers to choose from than their counterparts that have less specialist seating. As just one example, a ship with a commander engineering / miracle worker seat can use all of the ensign through commander rank engineering powers, as well as all of the ensign through commander rank miracle worker powers, versus a standard commander engineering seat that can only use engineering abilities. So the commander engineering / miracle worker seat is going to allow for additional powers that can help you adapt to the situation a little bit easier, perhaps. This isn't always the case, but in a lot of cases it can potentially, versus a standard engineering seat that only gives the one set of powers to pick from. So it could potentially be a case of, why just have one potential set of abilities and benefits when you could potentially have two or more? So the commander engineering / miracle worker seat is going to potentially give you more tools that you could draw from and use to better adapt to the situation with, versus the standard commander engineering seat. And this isn't always going to be the case, but again, it's going to depend on what you're looking to do. Another thing that I like to consider is, can it use a quote-unquote golden setup for tank powers? Now, a golden setup allows for perfect or near perfect allocation of core bridge officer powers for the chosen tank type. Now, what is considered a quote-unquote golden setup is going to vary from tank to tank. Somebody that's looking to be more of an off-tank is going to have a different golden setup than somebody that is towards the defensive side of things. Now, for me personally, and my preferred tanking toolkit, a golden setup allows me to use the following abilities. For tactical, I'm able to get a tactical team on the ship and either a fire at will or scatter volley, depending on whether or not I'm using beams or cannons, and an attack pattern delta, because delta is going to be one of your core abilities as a tank. For science powers, I like to be able to have a hazard emitters on my ship for purging certain debuffs, as well as the healing and damage negation it provides, then also science team to purge certain debuffs and for the bit of healing to your shields it gives you. For engineering powers, I like to have an engineering team, an emergency to weapons, an emergency to engines, and a reverse shield polarity. And this is kind of my generalized preferences for the tanking toolkit. Anything extra I can get after this, I consider to be just pure butter. Now, as some notes I made on this, torpedo spread is optional depending on what kind of build I'm putting together. Some builds call for a torpedo, some don't. It's just really going to depend on what I'm looking to do in that situation. Now, command abilities are great for reducing incoming damage. They have a lot of damage reducing abilities that you can throw out to debuff the enemy. You can throw abilities to regenerate yourself a bit more. And they tend to have, at least in my opinion, a lot more defensive abilities than particular offensive abilities. Whereas, in some instances, Miracle Worker is another example of one that I use from time to time, and it has, I would say, a bit more balanced amount of defensive versus offensive abilities. For example, with Miracle Worker, you can get narrow sensor bands, which is going to be a very nice boost to your damage output and also, by extension, your threat generation while it's active. There's also some other nice healing abilities that you can get from Miracle Worker as well, without going into too many huge details here. So that's, at least for me, what I look at when I'm considering the flexibility of the bridge officer seating. How much of my golden setup can I get on the ship? How much flexibility do I have to adapt to the situation overall if what I'm doing right now isn't cutting it, or I want to make some adjustments? The next big thing to consider is your weapons loadout. How many weapons can it hold? What kinds of weapons can it hold? Because some ships can use cannons or experimental weapons, whereas some can't. Now, ships that use dual or dual heavy cannons will have a different style of tanking and piloting versus a standard fire-at-will tank. This is because FAW tanks typically are going to be more broadside with their weapons versus cannons that are going to require a different style of piloting due to the difference in weapon arcs between cannons and beam arrays. A beam array is going to have a 270-degree arc, whereas the cannons are only going to have that forward-facing 45-degree targeting arc. So that's going to necessitate some differences in the piloting and so forth. For example, different weapon loadouts are going to lend more advantages to certain setups than others. As a specific example of this, a 5-3 layout is going to allow for more forward firepower potentially than a 4-3 or a 4-4 type of layout. And ships using cannons or dual banks are going to be able to use an additional dual bank or set of cannons on a 5-3 layout versus a 4-4 or a 4-3. And if the goal is more forward-facing firepower, this can allow for more of that, and by extension, potentially for a bit more knockdown power and threat potential. So it's just going to depend on what you're looking for as far as the weapons. Another thing to consider is console layout. Ships with console layouts that lean too far into one type of console or another can be very restrictive in terms of available tools to certain tank types. And ships with a more balanced console approach may not necessarily excel in any particular specialized build type, but can grant potentially more flexibility to certain tank types. As an example, a ship that is 4 engineering, 3 science, and 4 tactical can be a bit more balanced approach for ships towards the middle of the tanking spectrum, or maybe towards the defensive side a little bit. And off tanks wanting more threat or firepower, or science tanks, may not necessarily find this type of setup ideal, because they may not necessarily be able to bring as many of their specialized consoles to bear, and something like this is going to be a bit better platform for a jack-of-all-trades type of tank, or a type of setup. On the opposite side of the coin, A setup that is 3 engineering, 4 science, and 5 tactical can potentially provide more options to tanks towards the off-tank side of the spectrum and science-type tanks, as they're going to be able to bring more of their specialist consoles to bear. This means they're going to better be able to play to the strengths of their builds than a jack-of-all-trades kind of tank using the same setup. So that's kind of some stuff to keep in mind as far as your console layout, what you're looking to do. Next is the strengths and weaknesses of the ship. What can the ship do? What is it not so great at? First up, will you have to invest a ton of resources to compensate for weaknesses of the ship, or can you plug your particular favorite setup and take it out for a spin straight out of the dry dock? If a ship leans heavily towards the damage dealing / threat generation side of the spectrum, somebody looking to use that ship might have to invest a ton of resources into healing and negation to compensate for potential weaknesses in those areas, and the ship may have lower stats for a more siege type of tank. On the opposite end of the coin, a ship that leans too heavily towards the defensive side of the spectrum may require a lot more investment into the damage dealing and threat generation side to compensate for potential weaknesses of the ship, and it may not have as many damage / threat boosting type of powers for a more off-tank kind of setup. So again, you're playing to the strengths and weaknesses of the ship. How do you play to the strengths of the ship and also account for the weaknesses of the ship as well? Speaking of, what kind of mastery package does the ship have? Because the innate ship abilities can grant a lot of advantages to one type of tank versus another, and removing a lot of the need for investment into certain areas of the ship, allowing you to dedicate those resources towards the strengths of the ship instead of having to compensate so much for the weaknesses. To kind of put some of this in practice, we're going to take a look at a few ships here. The first is our Fleet Eclipse Intel Cruiser. We have the Battle Cruiser Mastery Package, and two things that I see right away is the absorbative hull plating, which is going to give me plus 25 physical and kinetic damage resistance, as well as the enhanced hull plating, which is going to give me plus 25 all energy and radiation damage resistance. So straight away, I see that the ship has built in what amounts to essentially a free neutronium alloy armor's worth of negation without actually having to slot a neutronium alloy armor. So that's free negation that I'm getting straight out of the gate, and I'm not necessarily going to have to invest as much into negation potentially. Another thing that I see is the enhanced weapon banks, which is going to give me plus 15% critical severity. So this is just shy of 2 vulnerability exploiters worth of critical severity that I'm getting for free. So that's potentially, note that I say potentially, 2 consoles that I'm not going to have to worry about for the critical severity. That's 2 not locators, but 2 exploiters that now could potentially be turned into colony consoles, because I'm able to get the critical severity from the ship instead of having to rely on the consoles, and potentially more that I could put into healing and keeping myself alive. The last bit is the armored hull, which is 10% additional hit points for free. Always nice to have. I'm not very big in going out of my way to get that kind of thing, but if I can get it and pick up some threat and pick up some negation at the same time, then heck yeah, let's go for it. So looking at the rest of the stats of the ship, I see for bridge officer seating, it's a lieutenant commander tactical, a commander engineering / intel, lieutenant commander engineering, lieutenant science / intel, and an ensign universal. For our console layout here, you can see it's a 5 engineering, 2 science, 4 tactical. It's a hull modifier of 1.3475. I've never really understood why they do such weird numbers like that, and they don't just make it like a 1.35 at that point. But it is what it is, I guess. So, in terms of what you're going to be looking at for the base hull, at level 50, you're looking at 46,489, and at level 65, you're looking at 60,638 hull, roughly. That's, of course, once you plug the formulas in, which I can kind of touch base on in another video. Now, for our shield modifier, it's a 1.1, a turn rate of 10, a 4/4 weapons loadout. It can also load dual cannons, and it also has a standard cloaking device, not a battle cloak, but a standard cloaking device, and it can also use the gather intel abilities that are innate to intel primary ships. In fact, the Eclipse intel cruiser was one of the first intel primary ships that we ever got in game. In fact, one of the first tier 6 ships that we ever got in game. For its cruiser commands, you're only getting the weapon system efficiency, which is a minus 25% weapon power cost, and the strategic maneuvering, which is 10% flight speed and plus 3 to the turn rate. So, you're not going to have the attract fire ability like you would on some other stuff. I'll touch base on why that's significant in just a moment. But getting into our notes, some of the things that I noted here is that the mastery is going to grant a fairly good amount of upfront negation. So, again, you're getting from the mastery package a free neutronium alloy armor worth of resistances without actually having to slot a neutronium armor. Now, you could slot additional damage resistance if you think you need it, or you could potentially roll with what you've got. So that's a little bit less investment required into the negation side of things because of the absorbative and enhanced hull platings that you got from the mastery package. The enhanced weapon banks, once again, that's just a little shy of 2 vulnerability exploiters that you're not going to have to slot because you're getting the critical severity from the ship itself. And that's 2 consoles you could potentially devote towards the colony healing consoles versus having to worry about your severity as much. Or you could just stack more severity on there. Just, again, it depends on what you're looking to do. Another thing that I noted is that only 1 ensign universal seat is going to restrict the flexibility of the ship quite a bit. Now, you've got a decent amount of powers to pick from here. I know that intel in today's game isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but it still has some very nice powers even today, and just because a ship isn't strictly a miracle worker primary doesn't discount it as being a viable choice. I honestly wish more people would occasionally bust out the older builds and not necessarily rely too much on today's hotness, if you know what I mean. But anyway, some other notes that I made for this particular ship is that it's going to cater towards engineering heavy builds a bit more, and it may require a bit more investment into the damage / threat side of things for off-tank style builds versus a ship that has more innate threat generation than damage negation. I was thinking my words there for a moment, folks. But that's kind of the way I would look at the Fleet Eclipse Intel Cruiser there. Now, the next ship we're going to look at is the Borg Juggernaut. Now, for its mastery package, it has the, of course, Juggernaut package, which gives us the devastating weaponry, which is 2.5% crit chance. Our enhanced weapon banks is making another appearance for 15% critical severity. We also get rapid repairs, which regens 1.25% of maximum hull every 3 seconds in space, with 3% hull being regenerated out of combat. Then we have our enhanced weapon systems, which is a plus 10% kinetic and all energy damage. So straight away, based off the mastery package, the biggest thing that I'm seeing with it versus the Eclipse is that the Juggernaut is a bit more focused on the threat / damage dealing side of things. So this means I'm going to have to invest a little bit more into the damage negation and damage recovery side of things to keep towards the middle of the tanking spectrum. So this means this ship is going to go in to missions and similar, and it's not going to have any built-in damage negation like the Eclipse is going to have. So that's something I'm potentially going to have to compensate for. Now, as far as its layout here, you can see it is a Commander Tactical / Command, Lieutenant Tactical / Miracle Worker, Lieutenant Commander Engineering. Then we also have a Lieutenant Commander Universal and an Ensign Universal. We also have a 4 Engineering, 2 Science, 5 Tactical layout, hull modifier of 1.35. You can see the base hull for level 50 and level 65 there. Shield modifier of 1.45, turn rate of 5, weapons loadout of 5.3, can equip dual cannons, and it gets the plasma disintegrator ability, which is the very huge plasma bolt. You might see a Borg pickle fire from time to time, or something similar to it, rather, I should potentially say. And you also get the inspiration abilities that come with a command primary spec ship, which is actually very nice. So, some of the things that I noted for this particular ship is that it's extremely flexible on the types of tank build that you can put on it because of the way the bridge officer setup is. You've got the Lieutenant Commander Universal and the Ensign Universal. So, you're going to have to automatically, if you want any science on the ship, you're going to have to make something there a science seat, possibly the ensign seat. However, if you wanted to cater more towards the engineering side of things, you already have 3 powers anyway. You could potentially have up to 7 engineering type of powers. You could potentially, if for some kooky reason you wanted to, you could have up to 10 tactical powers. You could have 4 science powers on there. It's just going to depend on what you're looking to do. Are you wanting more of an off-tank kind of setup? Or are you wanting more of a defensive kind of setup? And for this particular ship, another thing that I've noted is that it slants very heavily towards the off-tank type of builds, but can make a great siege tank as well. It's just going to require more investment into the negation and recovery for siege type tank builds. So this is what I'm seeing with the Juggernaut. And even for my personal taste, I did actually throw the Soul Defense set on this ship versus the Kobali, which I know for some of my longtime viewers out there, oh my god, blasphemy, he's not using the Kobali set, oh my god. But that was a small price to pay to potentially compensate for that weakness of the Borg Juggernaut. Alrighty guys, we had to pause the recording for a moment because my 2 pussycats were knocking some stuff over, and as any of you know out there that have cats as pets, you guys know that cats will cat, and sometimes they will cat in ways that you don't want them to cat, and, well, it can either be hilarious or really annoying depending on what they get into, but you love the little fur balls all the same. But that being said, we were going to look at our legendary Defiant as our last ship before wrapping this up and give you guys some bits of thought process on that. So, looking at our mastery package, we see we have the Destroyer mastery package. This is going to give us our devastating weaponry, which is 2.5% crit chance, the enhanced weapon banks for the severity, the precise weapon systems for a bit of accuracy rating, Also, the enhanced weapon systems, which is the plus 10% kinetic and all energy damage boosting. So straight away, a big thing that I see based off of just the mastery package is that this is another ship that's not going to have any built-in innate damage negation or damage recovery. So that's a potential weakness I may have to compensate for if I wanted to use this ship. As far as its bridge officer seating goes, you can see it has a commander tactical / pilot, lieutenant tac, lieutenant commander engineering, a lieutenant sci, and a lieutenant universal / pilot. So in terms of bridge officer flexibility, not a lot to really play with, as you've only got a lieutenant universal / pilot. Now that doesn't discount the ship from being a viable option, it's just something to keep in mind. For the console layout, you can see here it's a 4 engineering, 2 science, 5 tactical. We have a hull modifier of 1.25. You can see what those values would equate to at level 50 and level 65. Has a shield modifier of 0.95, turn rate of 15.5. It is a 5-3 layout, can equip dual cannons, comes with the phaser quad cannons, and also has pilot maneuvers. Now, some of the notes that I made here were that the ship heavily favors a more tac-heavy or off-tank style build, and the Lieutenant Universal / Pilot seat doesn't really grant a lot of flexibility to the builds that you can use. So this ship would require more investment into the negation and recovery side of things for a siege tank type of build, and the siege tanks may find themselves actually with an overabundance of threat / damage centric powers, and this particular ship isn't going to have as much in terms of hull and shield capacity as the larger ships are going to have for siege tanking. So while you can make a siege tank with a Defiant, you're going to have to make a lot more investment into compensating for the lack of negation and recovery, and potentially for not having as much hull and shielding. And this is also going to lend some advantages to a cannon style build based on the 5-3 layout and more forward firepower facing builds. So you do have some options with a legendary Defiant. Not as many as you would have with, I would say, the Borg Juggernaut previously, but it's still a fine ship, and hopefully you guys can kind of see what I'm getting at with this and why I say the things that I do about the legendary Defiant. So anyway folks, that's pretty much our video for this time around. Hopefully I've given you guys some bits of food for thought to think of. You've got some things to consider now when deciding what kind of a ship you want to tank with, what kind of tank maybe you want to actually create, and you have some ideas that you can use to decide what is going to be best for you and your overall goals as a tank. Again, this wasn't meant to be a universal standard, but to give you guys a sort of launching off point and sort of how I personally evaluate tanks, and nothing else, just spitball some build theory with some folks out in the community. But anyway folks, hope this has been helpful. We're going to cover some additional topics for our Tanking 101 series and branch out into maybe some more advanced topics as we go on. But for now folks, this is Captain Blade J52, and we are signing off.